Michael, welcome. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob. I have the pleasure of having been to all 25 of these meetings, and it's nice to be able to talk about something I'm so passionate about. I'm actually going to concentrate on some additional non-disease prevention or non-primary disease prevention effects of vaccination. I don't think it's going to sell vaccines any greater than we currently do, but I think it's really important for us to have an understanding that there might be some, if you like, off-target effects of vaccination. I have, oops, that went too quickly, but I've received honoraria from most vaccination companies, but I don't have any shares or direct financial conflicts with any companies at all in the pharma area. So why is the lifetime course of vaccination important? Along with appropriate lifestyle and healthcare interventions, it provides an opportunity to live and age in good health. So vaccination is just as important as nutrition, exercise, medications, not smoking, etc. The value of vaccines, in fact, is greater than just about everything except providing clean drinking water. It's saved 4.4 million people per year, and the total is about $150 billion saved. The ratio of input to output is about 44. You get 44 times value of vaccination compared to not vaccination. Now, we know, as Tony and others have said, that there's changes in our immune system with age, particularly in T cells, where the naive T cell numbers decrease. T cells recognise a smaller number of antigens and ageing T cell numbers increase, and memory T cell responses are impaired. And in older adults, vaccines overcome the smart vaccines using things like adjuvants or RNA technology, overcome these changes in the immune system. So not only do they overcome our increased risk of developing disease, but they also overcome our decreased ability to respond to a standard vaccine. And this leads to improved quality of life and reduced infectious diseases. These are the direct effects of vaccination. So we reduce mortality, as we've heard, from pneumococcus, tetanus, diphtheria, Hep A and B, influenza, but we also improve quality of life, particularly against when we vaccinate against pertussis and shingles, as Tony showed. But are there other benefits of vaccination beyond these disease prevention and improved quality of life effects? And the answer is yes. Vaccination in older people can reduce disease-associated complications, particularly in the vascular domain. So reduced ischemic stroke, reduced myocardial infarction, reduced admission to ICU from both pneumococcal and influenza vaccination. These have been shown across a range of studies. It's better if you're vaccinated against both. By helping to prevent acute infections, and this is the interesting point, immunisation seems to also affect other long-term diseases which have complications and costs. For instance, if we look at influenza vaccination, there's a 56% overall reduction in cardiovascular mortality, a 36% overall reduction in dementia risk after influenza vaccination, and a 13% overall risk reduction in ischemic stroke. And we get the same sort of findings also from zoster vaccination, where there's a 14% reduction in myocardial infarction, about a 30% dementia risk reduction, and I'll be drilling down on some of these statements, but there are references there, and a 16% overall risk reduction in ischemic stroke. So these are important non-target, off-target, if you like, effects of vaccination that we must consider, but never enter, unfortunately, the economic evaluations that we've just heard about. So there's a bit of a delay in the clicker here. We're getting there. So could this be a direct off-target effect of vaccination? It's been known for years that BCG vaccination for bladder cancer reduced the risk of dementia. And there's been animal models supporting some pathology behind that. I'll come to that later. But it's hard to believe, of course, that vaccination against a specific microorganism could reduce such disparate diseases. And I'm going to concentrate on dementia risk reduction, but there also is evidence to show that vaccination, for instance, reduces the risk of depression. I don't have time to go into that today. So here's a couple of studies that come from Wales that I think support the benefit of shingles vaccination on dementia risk reduction. Zoster vaccination was made available in Wales to those aged 70, and I'll come to the exact date in the next study. There has been very little leakage, about 0.01% into the private market. Welsh people don't pay for vaccines. 56% of those aged 70 were vaccinated over the study period, so it's a fairly good uptake, not dissimilar to what we achieved in Australia. And in this study, they were followed up for 7 years. Incident dementia was either Alzheimer's or vascular, which is a little bit simplistic, but good enough for this study. And the vaccinated were compared with the unvaccinated. And here's the results. Basically, the hazard ratio of developing dementia was 0.72, in other words, a 28% risk of developing all dementia, a 19% risk of Alzheimer's, and a 36% reduced risk of vascular dementia. Now, this seemed to be so whether the person subsequently developed shingles or not. So on the right-hand side, you've got shingles plus V minus, which means they've had shingles, but they weren't vaccinated, and so on. And you can see that the risk reduction was not dependent on subsequently developing shingles, or indeed the order, whether you had shingles before vaccination or the other way around. Now, there were, it's hard, you can't see the slide, but this just showed that there were numerous risk factors in the population, and vaccination doesn't seem to have been evenly distributed across the board. You are more likely to be, in fact, I beg your pardon, you are less likely for some perverse reason to have been vaccinated if you had risk factors for some of the diseases such as cardiovascular disease and indeed vascular dementia. So there is a methodology problem here. There was a selectivity in vaccination, but it actually worked to support the hypothesis because, as I said, you are less likely to be vaccinated if you had these risk factors. Nevertheless, if you look at the hazard ratio for developing shingles after vaccination, well, it's down by 57%, as you'd hope. Mortality was down by 42%, stroke by 14%, but cancer was not reduced. So the assumption here is that most likely vaccination was reducing cardiovascular complications, which we saw earlier on, but not cancer. And therefore, the effect on dementia, particularly vascular dementia, was probably mediated by a reduced risk of cardiovascular complications in those who are vaccinated. So conclusion, zoster vaccination reduced the risk of incident dementia. It's not mediated by a reduced incidence of shingles, and it's likely mediated by improved cardiovascular health. But I think the most interesting study was presented at a meeting I was at last year. And this is based on the fact that in Wales, basically, if you were 70 on September the 2nd, 1933, you were not eligible for vaccination. But if you turned 70 the following day, you were. And as I said, very little private uptake. So basically, a single date determined whether people got shingles vaccination or not in Wales. There was no other health intervention that was associated with the date. And therefore, you can do an analysis of the risk of subsequent dementia over a 7-year period. And you'll see that the probability of a new dementia diagnosis over this 7-year period was 3.5 percentage points less, which corresponded to a nearly 20% relative reduction in the occurrence of dementia, all based on your birthday. You can see that in the next chart here. Basically, if you were born on September 2nd, 1933, your risk was as shown in the left-hand side of that graph. But if you were born the following day, your risk of developing dementia over 7 years suddenly dropped. And that does seem to be likely just an effect of vaccination. There's another study here which is based on claims, large American study, age over 64, initially free of dementia, 8-year follow-up. This looked at diphtheria, tetanus and acellular pertussis and in its various forms, and both forms of shingles vaccination and also both forms of pneumococcal vaccination. And what this study showed, again, was very large numbers of cases of dementia in the vaccinated and unvaccinated groups. And it showed that ideally, 2 different vaccines in each group significantly reduced your risk of dementia. If you look at the number needed to treat, it was about 30 vaccinated to prevent 1 case of dementia over that 7 years. The lowest number needed to treat, 14, about halfway down that line there, was people who had Zostavax and then had 2 doses of Shingrix. So it seems that multiple vaccines in a disease group are more effective than single vaccines. So all 3 vaccination types reduced dementia due to Alzheimer's over the subsequent 8 years from about 11 to 8%, which equates to about a 25 to 30% lower risk of dementia in those vaccinated versus unvaccinated, and more than 1 vaccine in a class seemed to be better. This is pneumonia vaccination in a prospective cohort study amongst subjects who hadn't had Alzheimer's as of age 75 in the cardiovascular health study. It basically looked at the effect of having a specific allele linked closely to E4. Now, those of you who are dementiologists, and I know there's not many of you in the audience, but would know that E4 is a significant risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease. This gene was one very closely linked to that. And basically what this study showed was, if you look at the bold figures, the p-value bold figures in the middle there, was that overall you are less likely to develop dementia if you'd received pneumococcal vaccination, but that was only in those who had the E4 gene, which is an interesting finding. Now, finally, there's a meta-analysis that's looking at 17 studies, 1.8 million participants with numerous vaccines. Each study included 1 or up to 3 different vaccines and followed up between 3 and 20 years. And if you just look at the red diamond down the bottom, there was approximately a 35% risk reduction, reduced risk of developing dementia when you analyse all of these studies together, a Cochrane-type analysis. So whatever vaccines you had, they all varied between the studies. The overall effect on dementia risk reduction in this meta-analysis was a 35% reduction. Now, that's remarkable. That's actually greater than the amount of risk reduction you get if you attend to all of the risk factors that have been identified in the recent Lancet Commission on the Prevention of Dementia: physical exercise, reduced smoking, mental activity, social engagement, reduced depression, Mediterranean diet. Put all that together, you reduce your risk of dementia across your lifetime by 40%. Vaccination reduces it by 35%. And that's going to be relevant because we're going to get some very expensive drugs soon, and they're not going to be anywhere near as effective as that, and cost a vast amount more. Now, how can this protective effect be explained? Is it an anti-inflammatory effect, or are we reducing the inflammatory response by reducing the severity of infection? We know inflammation is a risk factor for all forms of dementia, including Alzheimer's. Are we inciting an immune response against unwanted proteins, such as those that characterise Alzheimer's, amyloid and tau? Is the vaccination essentially acting as an adjuvant? Now, previous studies, as I've shown, have demonstrated that BCG, but also influenza vaccines in animal models can enhance and maintain microglial activation, restore brain immune homeostasis, and reduce the burden of amyloid pathology, ultimately improving cognitive impairment. Microbes may also induce Alzheimer's pathology. This is a theory that's been bouncing around, particularly with the herpes virus that I know that Tony dreams about most nights. Gut microbiome is increasingly recognised as a risk factor for AD and other dementias, and amyloid has antimicrobial effects that may be a response to infection. So the idea of indirectly preventing dementia through preventing infection, or somehow modifying the link between infection and gut microbiome and Alzheimer's pathology, is also intriguing. Lastly, there are other off-target effects of vaccination. Other off-target effects of vaccination could include heterologous lymphocyte responses, trained innate immunity, or stabilisation of the blood-brain barrier. And I think I've gone 16 seconds over, but the take-home message is vaccination is good. Thank you.
So thank you. What a salesman. That's pretty cool. We have a chance for a few individual questions, but while we're targeting some, can we have the other speakers I think we want them up on the stage again. Is that right? So we can get the panel discussion. But I'll take one from the floor while we're going. So we can have and we want people on the stage for the panel. Is that right? Yeah, so that we can show it.
I'm certainly supporting the message of vaccination is good, but I'm just asking about the question of potential confounders in some of those studies in terms of the vaccinated group versus the non-vaccinated group and the risk of dementia, etc.
Yeah, that's right. That's why I tried to address that. I think the most powerful one is this Welsh study that shows that, a 1 day difference in birth date isn't going to affect your risk factors. It might, however, as I said, have somewhat affected the risk of being vaccinated. I did indicate that. But as I said, it worked the other way if you looked at that data. So I don't think being born 1 day later should reduce your risk of dementia by such a substantial amount. I think that's a very powerful finding.
Okay, John had a question, but just to tell people what online we're getting, how come a private vaccine for the Zostavax you end up with a recommendation 12 months later, a public one is 5 years? The correlation of protections, are there any? How long is too long between the first and the second dose, or should you start again? And stopping some of the methotrexate inhibitors. So they're the questions we're getting online. But John, do you want to start the ball rolling?
Just a comment from Michael. Mike, you didn't comment on the vaccines against smoking, and it's pretty depressing. They've had very limited effects, so there hasn't been a rule.